All right. Thank you for making your way back. I think you will find that cutting short your lunch and coming back quickly is going to be well remunerated, well paid, because our keynote speaker for lunchtime is none other than Roger Jones, who is coming to us at the recommendation of the Assembly of First Nations. And when the Assembly of First Nations chooses people to represent the Grand Chief, Terry Bellegarde, they take a great deal of care. And that was the case during an international conference, a major international conference that Amos Key and I attended during the summer, which was a conference here in Toronto of language commissioners of the world. And the AFN sent Roger to give a major address to the language commissioners of the world on the creation of the bill, C-91, the co-development, and a preliminary assessment, I think it must have been during the summer, on how the bill would contribute to the promotion and development of Indigenous languages among First Nations. Now that we have moved on a few months, and we heard last night the beginning of some news from the Department of Canadian Heritage on what their plans are for implementing the bill, we're very, very curious to hear the AFN view as a co-development partner to the Department of Canadian Heritage, how AFN sees the imminent implementation of C-91. So, without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to Roger. Thank you.
Miigwech Dinok Mampian Dazijik Yidney Green Mampi Win Question. Good afternoon, everyone. And you are a more distinguished audience than the international commissioners audience was. Until my next speaking engagement. But the national chief does send his greetings and his regrets. And I do want to thank Ian and Amos for welcoming my participation since they've seen my act before. And I am pleased to be here, and I am glad and commend the organizers for having this discussion. As you know, it is the International Year for Indigenous Languages, and that year is coming to a close, obviously, in the next few days, by the end of December. And there is an event taking place on December 18th in New York at the UN General Assembly to commemorate the Indigenous Year for the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And the prospect is high that the UN General Assembly will declare a decade, an international decade for Indigenous languages, which could possibly start in 2022. So possibly a couple of years from now. But I had the benefit of listening to Grand Chief Willie Littlechild, who's of course one of the most eminent and smartest people I know. He said, let's start the work in 2020, so we'll actually have the benefit of 12 years instead of 10 years. And I think he provides some excellent advice on that. And in this year of the International Year for Indigenous Languages, there is a website. I'm not sure if Ian, you're aware, but you can register an event like this on the site, which counts towards the cumulative activities and events around the International Year. And I gather what it does is that it does show the UN community that there is some benefit, and there has some benefit and activity related to the designation of this year as the International Year for Indigenous Languages. And I think they were at something like 960 registered events.
For Canada?
No, for the globe. And so I think they're encouraging others to, if you haven't registered your event, register your event, and it'll help show the importance of Indigenous languages. So my basic view of the Indigenous Languages Act is it's a tool. It's not the magic wand by any means. The work of revitalization, restoration, strengthening of our languages belongs in our communities, among our people, and that's what we did here from people across the country. With respect to my background, Anishinaabe is my first language. That's what I was taught from birth to when I went to grade school at the age of 6. So I understand as much as I think I can, the importance of language and culture and spirituality with respect to a person's well-being, the well-being of the family, the community, and the nation. I got those teachings from my mother, from my parents, from my grandparents, and family and community. And people my age and older, we speak our language fluently at home. The next generation, not so much. The generation after, none, right? So we have a lot of work to do in our own home community to restore the language, and that's how I kind of view this work on the legislation. I've served as a member of council at home for 6 years, so I know the pressures and the priorities that chief and council and our own government has to deal with. And language, of course, is as important, if not more important, among those other priorities. And it is important to, and I listened to the conversation and the discussion this morning, and I couldn't agree more with what people said, both from this side of the table and people commenting. The presentation that I was asked to make was, of course, not so much at that high level, but rather I was told that part of the discussion here was to try and look forward and understand how the Indigenous language landscape will evolve now that Bill C-91 has been passed into law. And it is law. It is Government of Canada law. It's not First Nations law. It's not Inuit law. It's not Métis law. I think in each of those circumstances, whether it was First Nations or the Inuit or the Métis, this law would look very different from what it looks like. But the fact is that this is Government of Canada law. In the midst of this work, and in this time or a little bit earlier last year in November, Supreme Court of Canada decided an important case called Mikisew, basically Mikisew 2, where they had challenged the lawmaking and the policy-making process of government, arguing that and this was mostly in relation to the environmental legislation that had been passed, that the Mikisew had not been properly consulted. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, there are certain customs, there are certain conventions, there are certain constitutional principles in Canada which need to be preserved. Things like parliamentary privilege, cabinet, confidentiality, the ability of Parliament to decide issues with respect to the spending of money, right? Supreme Court's not going to challenge those or change the rules, so long as the Supreme Court of Canada is formulated the way it is, which is it is filled with people who subscribe to that system. And until we get other people who have a different perspective on things, including Indigenous people, that's not going to change anytime soon. So the rules are stacked against us. That's just the reality. And we keep fighting, and we'll keep fighting to try and level the playing field. So this legislation, I think there were two important objectives that our people expressed in the course of our discussions about it from coast to coast to coast. First of all, they said financial resources is priority one. People knew what they wanted to do with respect to revitalizing, restoring, and strengthening their languages, whether it was in their schools or whether it was through adult learning or the different approaches, such as the mentor apprentice approach, language nests, what have you. They knew what they wanted to do, but they needed the resources to be able to do it. So they said, job one, resources. We need the legislation to address resources. To the extent that this Canadian system allows any legislation to say anything about funding, this legislation talks predictable, sustainable, long-term funding, which is what people said. We can't live by annual proposals, projects. It has to be comprehensive, and it has to be long-term, really to support what are the strategies and the plans that the communities or the people who are championing these languages, what are those strategies that they want employed and applied over the next 10, 20, 50 years, right? So we actually did some costing work, or commissioned some costing work for that. The best work which was produced for us established that the funding level for the next 10 years, or the first 10 years, towards implementing the legislation, would be in the neighborhood of $6.5 billion. So the government's investment of $333 million falls way short. And that's the first thing that was expressed to government upon the release of budget 2019-2020, which is where that $333 million commitment is expressed. They heard it. They've heard it loud and clear. Whether or not they're about to make that kind of investment is another matter, right? We'll see into the future. That work, which identified the cost figure, was based on need, was based on supporting the education system to be able to provide teaching and learning in our own Indigenous languages. And don't forget, we've got over 60 Indigenous languages in this country. So the needs are great. The methods or the approaches that people take might be different, but nevertheless, the best we could do was to come up with that estimate. So investing in education, but also investing in obviously trying to restore the language capacity of adults as well. So a big a big investment required, but you know, the view of the people was, insofar as the government of Canada was concerned, well, you created this problem, now you solve it and you pay for it. And the other part of what was really important for people was constitutionalizing Indigenous language rights, which is why there is Section 6 of the Indigenous language rights, which specifically connects language rights, Indigenous language rights, to Section 35 of the Constitution Act. People spoke this morning about French as a constitutional right. In my view, the Indigenous Languages Act establishes Indigenous languages as a constitutional right. So what I believe the legislation enables is for people to be able to use the law and the Constitution to enforce their language rights, much in the same way that the French community in this country has been able to advance their rights, secure, you know, solid financial support for their language rights, together with the Official Languages Act. Now, when we spoke with our people across the country, we asked them, do you want your language to be recognized as an official language? And they said no. The reason being that they did not trust the government to try and control and manage the language. They said, those are our languages. If those are our languages and if they are constitutional rights, we will make our own laws with respect to protecting them, to advancing them, and expect the government that if language law is part of our governance, that they have to support the cost of our exercise in lawmaking and the provision of services, programs, education pursuant to our law. We expect the government to be able to support that through intergovernmental or fiscal arrangements. So that was the second really important point that people wanted reflected in the legislation, which we believe it does. One of the big issues for the government of Canada was this creation of the Indigenous Languages Commissioner's Office, and mostly by reason that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 3 principal calls to action relating to language was: do the language legislation, provide predictable long-term sustainable funding, and thirdly, create an Office of the Languages Commissioner, Indigenous Languages Commissioner. When we asked our people about that, they were soft on that. Nevertheless, they said, if you can create a Language Commissioner's Office, whose principal role is to monitor and supervise governments, the federal governments, well, I suppose to a lesser degree, any other governments, compliance with the legislation, then that's a useful office to have. So that was the idea of the Indigenous Languages Commissioner's Office, is to keep the government's feet to the fire, as it were. But secondly, the Language Commissioner's purpose and mandate in terms of reference does provide him or her the ability to respond to requests from Indigenous peoples from across the country or from wherever, to be able to provide some service, some help and support with things that they're doing, even in the context of assessing the state of your language in your own community or in your nation, language planning, and what I mean, it's an important step to have to do your language planning. So you've got a map and a path forward that you're going to follow based on the situation of your language and where you want to end up. And where you want to end up, and this is what we heard all the time, is the restoration of fluency. Not just enabling people to say hello and their names in Anishinaabe or their own Indigenous language, but to be able to converse, to be able to understand that knowing your language and knowing your culture is what enables you to understand our own worldviews, our holistic approaches to life. That's the way that information and your own education is going to enable you to know who you are, where you come from, and hopefully enable the self-determination of people, of your people into the future. So those are important points we wanted to capture in the legislation. We had some success. In other instances, we didn't have the greatest success, because, like I said, if it was up to us, we would have written this legislation in a different way. But the other thing which we were mindful of is sometimes it's the implementation which is more important. That's where the heavy lifting gets done. And we insisted on being involved in the implementation phase, which is what we're in now, post June 21st, after the legislation was given royal assent. So we have this implementation committee, which includes the First Nations, ITK and MNC, and Culture and Heritage Department. And we have an agenda which really tries to address what are those things in the legislation that need to be worked out. For instance, there's language in the legislation which connects education and lifelong learning as important for restoring Indigenous languages. So what does that mean? What are the kinds of things that need to be worked out in that regard? Certainly funding is one of them. But the other also has to deal with the reality that in the Canadian Constitution, it's the provinces that have the jurisdiction with respect to education. Our schools are run pursuant to provincial curricula. The people who teach in our schools get certified by the provincial governments, which means, and this was pointed out in some of the discussion this morning, that our elders and our knowledge keepers, who are the ones that have the ability to transmit our language, are not recognized as licensed, certified, teaching teachers in our schools. And if you're going to establish land-based learning in your curriculum, that means you're the one that should be exercising control over the curriculum, not the provincial government. But you're going to have some kind of intergovernmental relationship as between your law in running and controlling your schools and your language requirements with those of other levels of governments. And again, that's provided for in the legislation. We also were told that there is a need for language entities on a regional basis, and a perfect example of that is the First Peoples Cultural Council in British Columbia. You're going to hear from Susan Gessner, I think, in the next panel. She works there. They do excellent work in this whole area, and they're a capacity building entity, and they work directly with communities to help them with language assessments, language planning, and so on. We don't have those right across the country. Those things should be created where they're needed and supported through federal funding to provide that support. There was a big issue about the provision of programs and services in an Indigenous language, and certainly in Nunavut, where the majority of the population speaks and Inuktitut, it's obviously logical and reasonable to expect that your government and service delivery is going to be done in that language. That wasn't such a big issue for our people across the country. But they did say, yeah, it is necessary to make sure that the program and service delivery capacity of the federal government does acknowledge and does facilitate that there has to be those instances where the service delivery is done in the Indigenous languages in different parts of the country. So that's an item which we still have to address. There will be parliamentary and independent review of the legislation. First one in 3 years. After the appointment of the commissioner, there will be a 3-year review, and then there will be a 5-year review as well. So the intention there is to work out what that process is, how to be inclusive of Indigenous peoples. There has to be a whole of government approach to this legislation. It's not only an issue for culture and heritage, it's an issue right across the various departments of the federal government. And there's got to be a strategy and a way in which to make sure that each federal government department is doing its job to conform with the legislation. And that's something which we'll be looking at. There's work to be done about how to facilitate this federal, provincial, territorial government cooperation around this, because there are areas and issues with respect to language, Indigenous languages, which are within the jurisdictional purview of federal, provincial, and territorial governments. There's a section in the legislation which talks about regulations, which is pretty normal. Every piece of legislation does contemplate regulations to address some of the finer detail around the legislation. So that's an agenda. The specific priorities, the two immediate priorities is developing the new and interim funding mechanisms. The Old Ally program, Aboriginal Languages Initiative, sunsets on March 31st, 2020. That's the program which had $5 million attached to it on an annual basis, which was wholly inadequate. So the new funding, which was announced in last year's budget, the 333 over 5 years, well, that's going to become operational on April 1st, 2020. There will be interim funding authorities that will be applied to distribute that funding in year one. The allocation of funding between years 2 and year 5, that's going to require a basic fundamental adjustment of the funding authorities, which will go towards the allocation and distribution of that money. So that's a priority, as is the establishment of the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages. That part of the act is not operational at this point until such time as the commissioner is appointed. We believe a commissioner can be appointed by the summer, has to be appointed basically by the fall of 2020, because the legislation says that part of the legislation will become operational in October, whether or not there's a commissioner, right? So of course the government doesn't want to have a legislation that says there's a commissioner and there's no commissioner. So, but I think it should happen quicker. The last thing I'll say is that one of the things at the Assembly First Nations that we did was in the summer we developed somewhat of a how-to guide. How to use the legislation for your work in your community or wherever you are. So it sets out somewhat of a guide that says, if you want to utilize the legislation, here's the things that you should start doing, including establishing some level of committee work in your community, because what you're going to have to do is do language assessments, you're going to have to do your language planning, and you're going to have to do this costing work, you're going to have to identify what your needs are going to be, your tools, so on and so forth. So you can just go on the AFN website, and there's a page there that'll take you to the guide and other information to try and help people on the ground work with what we've got. It's not perfect, it's not the end all be all, but it does provide some tools to go forward. I'll leave it at that, Ian. So, Jimmy West.
Okay, Jimmy West to you too. That was well done, and we do have actually 5 minutes and even with a little cushion before I hand over the gavel or moderator's stick to Mark Turin. I have a question actually. Sure. Do you really believe, though, that the quality of the language rights in C91 comes anywhere close to being operationalized as a francophone in a minority setting is able to operationalize the official languages rights available to them? It just seems to me that unless there is a court case that where we could draw upon, I doubt that that's the case. And one reason that I would say I doubt that that's the case is that the positioning of Article 35 in the Constitution as not part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms suggests that it's not actionable in the same way. It may be actionable in some way, but it's not actionable in the same way as official languages rights. So could you amplify?
Yeah, sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head that until such time as you make your best effort to enforce your right through the court system or whatever, and that might lead to negotiations to settle the matter, and you get the result that you want. The fact is, Section 35 has been used to enforce rights already, whether it's in the harvesting, fishing, hunting context. So just because they don't exist within the charter part doesn't make Section 35 unenforceable. If you recall, there was a deliberate decision made to keep 35 out of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms section. And that was a decision made, by the leadership back in the 1980s, based on legal advice. So, well, no, I mean there was leadership across the country, right? That said, let's not put our rights within the charter because the charter emphasizes individual rights. Our people, their rights, although they can be individualized, as in the case of hunting and fishing, they primarily belong to the collective, whether through treaty relations or through Aboriginal rights. They are enforceable so long as the court sees it your way, right? Now, the thing about treaty and Aboriginal rights is the courts have always placed the burden on our people to prove the rights. And that has been costly. That has required extensive evidentiary hurdles to say that your rights are rights, inherent rights. In this instance, because you have legislation that says your language rights are Section 35 rights, you have the ability to avoid this big hurdle of having to trot out evidence, which you clearly can, but which is going to be time consuming and costly. You say, here's a piece of legislation that says that our language rights are Section 35 rights. Now, what we interpret our rights to mean is such as, you know, me as an individual, if I'm relating to government service providers, I expect them to be able to speak to me in my language. Whether or not you're going to succeed is another matter, but we won't know that until such time as somebody puts it to the test, or that as this legislation and as the work evolves, like through this discussion around interpretation and translation, is that going to produce the best result for us in terms of people getting their services in their own languages? Are we going to be able to make our own laws with respect to declaring Indigenous languages as our official languages in our governments and our communities? I don't think there's much doubt about that in that instance. So I personally don't have much concern about our ability to enforce the rights, because they are connected now to the highest, to the supreme law of the land, as Section 52 says, right? That the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Section 35 is a part of the Constitution and it's part of the supreme law of the land. And now we've connected it to Indigenous languages as being part of the supreme law. That's how I would see it.
But it's going to take a collective case to nail it down.
Well, not necessarily. Like I said, this is a tool. This gives us leverage. I mean, oftentimes things get negotiated to the satisfaction of people, right? And that depends on the degree to which you have leverage, right? We didn't have as much leverage prior to June 21st, 2019, right? And I think people were generally afraid about risking putting their languages in the hands of the courts, right? Who could have said, no, your languages are not inherent rights or Aboriginal rights. We just don't agree. So why would you risk that? But if you can go to court now and say, we've got legislation that supports our view, you've got leverage.
Okay, well, I think we have to move from what could be a very interesting and long conversation to British Columbia and Alberta. Yeah, I'm afraid we have to. They're waiting, and thanks to Mark, they have been put off for half an hour. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
For that.